why was it that in the Americas, popular history, folk history, typically said that there was a pre-Columbian African and Asian presence in the Americas? Others even talked about the ancient Hebrew people being here. In fact, that's one of the foundations of the Mormon Church, is that some of the writings in the Book of Mormon suggest that there was a Hebrew presence as some of the Hebrew people left and came to the Americas. But they also say there was an Egyptian link, because they talk about aspects of Egyptian culture being there as well. And, and some people make fun of the Mormons, but the fact is, I give them credit for at least recognizing those two major truths. And it's also interesting to me that the name is Mormon because Mormon was Old Dutch for Moor, or Old German for Moor, right? And the angel Moroni, right? The angel Mormon and the angel Moroni, or Moroni. So what I'm saying is there's enough evidence in different places, if people were willing to look, indicating that there clearly was a pre-Columbian African and Asian presence in the Americas, that you can find the remnants of that in language, in artifacts, in cultural practices, in primary sources coming even from Spanish and Portuguese and English and French explorers. It's a lie that this was the new world in terms of Europeans being the first to settle among the indigenous peoples or Native Americans here, and that prior to Columbus, there were no other settlements or trading arrangements or peoples coming in from Africa or Asia, right? So that clearly is something that is problematic when someone talks about the history of the Americas and they say the New World. So Columbus discovered America. No, Columbus didn't discover America. Columbus was responsible for opening up the Americas to permanent settlements coming primarily from Europe. But Africans had always been going back and forth. I'd even say, just to be clear, Native Americans were also going to Africa and to other parts of the East. So this international exchange of people and goods was occurring long before Columbus. The newness argument was largely put out, again, in the interest of Eurocentric hegemony, to create a false narrative that serves to justify this idea that Europeans discovered the Americas and therefore had some greater right to its domination. When I look at people like Ivan van Sertima, the late great Ivan van Sertima, and they came before Columbus, who of course outlined the connections between the Olmec people and ancient Kemet or Nubia, I should say ancient Kemet and Nubia, when he talked about these exchanges occurring all the way back to some 3,000 years ago, 3,000 plus years ago. And when he starts talking about this in the 1970s, there are others who are also making similar arguments. Barry Fell, who was a Harvard professor who wrote Saga America and America BC, also a PhD, also dedicated, in fact, I think his original area of study was zoology or invertebrate zoology, but he became fascinated as a scientist by all this evidence, these clear indications of a pre-Columbian ancient link between Africa and the Americas. Even the Smithsonian sent people to do expeditions. Matthew Stirling had gone in and found what he called Negroid heads. And all anybody has to do is to look at the Olmec heads and see that these are quote unquote Negroid or Africoid in appearance. But let me also say something about how insidious Eurocentric hegemony or so-called white supremacy is. Mexican scholars, Mexican laypersons as well, the average person, knew that these giant Olmec heads were throughout different parts of Mexico, Tres Zapotes and La Venta, and other areas. They looked at these heads and said they look like, quote unquote, negros or Africanos to us. What European anthropologists did was claim that these heads were stylized baby jaguar faces, or they were infantile stylizations to try to negate the fact that here's evidence of this pre-Columbian presence of Africans in the Americas. And Cyrus Gordon, who was also another scholar of Mesoamerica, right? The pre-Columbian Americas. And Cyrus Gordon, who basically looked at different artifacts and said there's clear evidence that there was exchange between Africans and Native Americans and Asians and Native Americans long before Columbus ever arrived. There was a documentary that came out in the early 90s. You're going to love the name of this one. It was called The Curse of the Cocaine Mummies. And in The Curse of the Cocaine Mummies, this documentary talked about how, for some reason, scientists were finding cocaine in the hair shafts of mummies. Now, they also found tobacco. You may know that in forensics, when people are testing, if a pathologist is testing to see if someone's been poisoned, they'll take hair samples, because essentially anything that you ingest to eat will come out in the hair, or to anything, or much of it, in terms of the chemical compounds or components. So they took samples of these different mummies. The person who did it was a woman named Dr. Balabanova, who I think she is a French scientist, although her name, obviously, Balabanova is not French, but she, in France, and she did this research looking at these mummies and was wondering why she was finding cocaine in mummies, since there is no cocaine in Egypt. In fact, there's no cocaine known to grow in Africa, certainly not at that time. You're talking about 3,000 years ago and longer. You're talking about 2,500 years ago, etc. She took a sampling of different mummies to find that these mummies, obviously when alive, had ingested coca, the coca leaf. They also found high rates of tobacco, not African tobacco, American tobacco. So this automatically meant, well, how are these people getting this? They got it because they were in trade. Nile Valley civilization was in trade with different indigenous peoples in the Americas. But the beauty of it, again, to make the point about the connection to Moorish science, no other mainstream organization of African Americans was discussing that. None. So the Moorish Science Temple is the only organization that has this as part of the official literature in the 1920s, right? So the work that von Futenau was discussing, von Futenau doesn't put his work out until later. Von Futenau's earliest publications with regard to this, I think, are in the 60s and 70s. Leo Wiener, who was at Harvard, did talk about this in the 1920s, but it wasn't mainstream. It's just this lone Harvard scholar who's saying there was a connection between the Africans and the Americas before Columbus. Barry Fell is not writing about this until the 1970s, and others that are out there. Noble Drew Ali is putting this information out about the pre-Columbian African presence in the freaking 1920s. Come on, right? And the man doesn't get any credit? This is what is insane. Afrocentric scholars should be, in my estimation, really honoring this brother. Even if they're not a part of the movement, say, look, I may not be part of the movement for whatever reason, but I'm here to tell you, this brother was the real deal as far as how did he know this? And not only how did he know it, but how honorable it is that he then took that information and put it out there for the people to have. So you could walk into a Moorish Science temple and gain knowledge of this. And this area is actually eastern Panama and northwest Colombia. Names like Dobaida, Abe Beba, Aben Amici, Abreba, etc., seem to have a completely Moorish or biblical form. Now, this is coming from Brasseur de Bourbourg, who was writing in the 19th century. That was part of an 1861 study. So to have things like this coming from European scholars who recognize that these names don't sound foreign to names that you understand are from the East, right? That coupled with other things, with other evidence, collectively is what pushes the case, right? And then, as I mentioned before, Maravitine, Marabios, Morabita, these are Native American names that European anthropologists and linguists would find, and they're going, that's odd. Why do these indigenous people have these names? Maravitine, Marabios, it's in reference to the Marabouts or the Moabites. That's very odd, right? All of that, like I said, coupled with even references to the great expedition from Mali in the 14th century, where one of the Malian rulers, Abu Bakari II, who basically leaves with several hundred ships and sails for the Americas across the sea of fog and darkness, as some Arabic sources would call it. Well, why would he sail with so many ships unless he knew where he was going? He reports on the friendly Indians of Moronia, which was a province of Guyana, which is where, by the way, Ivan van Sertima was from. He was from British Guyana. And Harcourt had described these Egyptian-like pyramids among them, and saying that a very high hill called Kalipani, fashioned like a sugar loaf or a pyramid, existed. So things like that are just reminding us again that when Europeans came here, They were finding evidence of things like pyramids here. In fact, I think it's Jack Forbes who basically says that there's so much about American history that we know so little of, meaning pre-Columbian American history. That because we haven't focused on that pre-Columbian American history. And I would say it's by design, because if you looked at it, the obvious connections to Africa, the obvious connections to Asia would come out. One of the other things that Van Cernema talked about in his book, They Came Before Columbus, was how there were Chinese accounts, Chinese records from the 11th, I think it's the 11th and 13th, or the 12th and 13th centuries, AD or CE, which talk about Chinese expeditions and African expeditions of trade that took them across the Atlantic, and meaning to the Americas.